Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. For those of you I haven't had the pleasure to meet yet, my name is Rep Buttle, and I have the privilege of serving as a senior fellow here at the Aspen Institute in the Financial Security Program. And for the last 8 months, I've had the opportunity to work with both Ida Rademacher and Maureen Conway on an amazing body of work called the Reimagining Work and Wealth Initiative, which we're going to hear a little bit about today. Today's event is really about sort of the lessons we've learned and how we're moving forward. Oh, is this not working? How's that? There we go. All right. Today's event is really about lessons we've learned. In some ways, this is the capstone of 3 amazing years of work. And so we're going to look back at some of that work, and we're also going to talk about how we continue to move this work forward. Few housekeeping items. One is we are live streaming, and so would like to invite the folks who are joining us via live stream to join into the conversation as well. We're using the hashtag work and wealth. So I want to see lots of tweets from folks in the audience and lots of tweets from folks who are joining us online. Also, just quickly, want to announce that today we are really thrilled to release our 2017 Economic Security Summit report. And I think many of you know a lot of the work that we do on the Reconnecting Work and Wealth Initiative happens at the Economic Security Summit, which will also happen this year in Aspen, July 9th through 12th. This is an amazing report, and we're very fortunate to have Karen Kahn, who is the rapporteur for last year's report, here with us today. And so we want to thank her for all the hard work she did to capture last year's lessons learned, and we're very excited about the event this year as well. So just briefly, I want to thank the many participants of the initiative over the last 3 years. I also want to thank our partners, the Prudential Foundation, the Ford Foundation, and the Kellogg Foundation for their support of this amazing work over the last few years. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah Kay, who's the Vice President of Corporate Giving at the Prudential Foundation, who's going to moderate a wonderful conversation with Maureen Conway and Ida Rademacher. Sarah?
Thank you, Rhett. Can you all hear me? So as Rhett mentioned, I'm so thankful that you guys are all joining us today for this great conversation. I'm Sarah Kay from Prudential Financial, and as many of you heard probably by now, our company was founded over 140 years ago on the belief that everybody should have the opportunity to achieve financial security and a peace of mind for their families. Our founder, John Dryden, had a radical idea to provide affordable life insurance for working families. At the time, it went against the grain of business, and with that idea and with that first product, we created an inclusive market that provided financial protections for working families. We are still very much, we still stay true to that founding belief that financial security should be within reach for all. But we know today in this economy that economic mobility is on the decline and that inequality is growing. We know that people are working hard, but they're not able to achieve the financial security and prosperity that was once available to people back in the day. And we know with these hard times that many Americans are seriously anxious about their finances, no matter what income bracket they're in. And so, particularly from those from low-income, underserved communities, those challenges are even far greater and those opportunity gaps are widening. And with these economic inequalities, there are 2 fundamental components to this crisis, which is work and wealth. And that's why with these conversations that we've been having with the Aspen Institute, we approached the Aspen Institute to engage in this partnership to bridge these 2 siloed workspaces and these sectors that typically, both in policy and practice, hadn't interacted with each other. And so when we approached Ida and Maureen about this, we said, how do we bridge these 2 silos and how do we reconnect this conversation about work and wealth? Because you can't have one without another. A person's ability to earn a decent income and to build wealth are essential to that economic security. And so with that, I want to invite both Maureen and Ida to the conversation because we're going to hear a little bit about their thoughts and what they've learned as we've embarked on this partnership. And so, sit on this side. Okay.
Where?
You want to be in the middle?
Am I supposed to be in the middle? Okay.
This is okay.
Might play musical chairs a little here.
So I'm sure you all know Ida and Maureen, who've been leading the Financial Securities Program and the Economic Opportunities Program. And I wanted to hear a little bit from the both of them in terms of when we embarked on this partnership, when we approached you all about this idea of reconnecting work and wealth. Curious to hear what your thoughts were and what you thought was good and the value of collaborating between these 2 programs at the Aspen Institute.
You want to start?
Yeah, I can start. I mean, I think part of the start for me was deciding to come back to Aspen 3 years ago. I had been working for a number of years, and I know Andrea Levere is going to be speaking in the next piece of the panel, at Prosperity Now, focusing specifically on a lot of the wealth dimensions of low and moderate income households. And it was increasingly difficult to have a siloed conversation when labor share of income is so clearly declining. So the idea that for practitioners in the field and for the overall conversation that you could continue to talk about how do you help people build real nest eggs when the underlying precarity of their day-to-day financial lives was looming so large, felt like it felt disingenuous to honor and respect those families who you knew had the same aspirations, but had less and less of a toehold in the mainstream economy. So there's no place better to do collaborative work than Aspen, and nobody better to do it with than Maureen Conway, because I had actually worked with you on labor market strategies in a prior life here at Aspen. So the idea of bringing in external partners that would support that kind of collaboration as we really explored what's changing about financial markets and bring that into space with what's changing about labor markets was an opportunity that you don't say anything but yes to.
Great, and I guess I would just say, just to add a little bit from the perspective of the Economic Opportunities Program, and as Ida well knows, we have a long history of sort of looking at things kind of from the ground up. So in the Economic Opportunities Program, we spent a lot of time in communities across the country looking at what are the range of things that local governments, nonprofits, and other organizations are doing to try to help people who feel outside of the economic mainstream to connect to economic opportunity. And we have two main work streams, which is helping people connect to work and connect to good work, and helping people in entrepreneurship to start businesses and to build their livelihoods in that way. And I think about sort of the work we were doing to reconnect work and wealth. You know, we were trying to, we'd been doing this work, we had this very deep work going on how people can connect to work and can move up in the labor market. But one of the things that kept sort of dragging people down was they couldn't get to this basic level of economic stability that you get to when you have a measure of wealth, right? And so we really needed to think about how do we connect work and wealth so people can build the level of economic stability that they need to actually pursue economic mobility and to be able to pursue opportunity. So it was sort of like we were thinking about it from both the practice side and the policy side, from sort of both looking at the national numbers, but also looking at what's going on in communities. Sort of there was just this growing need to really think about how do you connect these ways of thinking to really help families kind of manage their economic lives in today's economy.
And I think one of the goals when we first embarked on this conversation was to change the national conversation and the dialogue and to catalyze new ideas. What do you both think in terms of the last couple of years we've accomplished through this reconnecting of work and wealth?
Yeah, you know, I think the summits themselves trace an arc of that. We started out in some ways with a pretty macro level conversation about, and at the same time, folks who were not traditionally, literally in the same room together, that spoke different vernaculars, had different acronyms, often the same acronym meaning completely different things in a labor market and a financial market. Equity, for example, quite different, thinking about financial markets and labor markets. Financial equity, people's stake in an economy. There are people that start about this and very rarely actually think about the household implications of macroeconomic trends. And there's a lot of people that start at the household that very rarely thought about the macroeconomic drivers of what was actually playing out in the day-to-day decision-making of firms in how they were investing or not investing or divesting in their workforce. And so at the very beginning, we were trying to find our feet in a shared conversation. And what I think is one of the values of that is that we were able to quite genuinely be in service of the dialogue. So the first year's set of people that came together really informed who could be around a table the next year and how much more you could reach across, how much more time you needed actually for off-the-record conversations and sidebar conversations to spark collaborations. And we'll talk, I think, about some of those things. But for some of that, I mean, I would say, you know, that was genuinely in service of the shared conversation. It also, for me, really informed the work I did back in the mainstream programming of the Financial Security Program. We launched EPIC, the Expanding Prosperity Impact Collaborative, which is an 18-month deep dive into one financial challenge at a time. You know, what are the dimensions of it? What are the drivers of it? How do you solve it? Who commits to solving it? And the first thing we took on was income volatility, because from doing this work and wealth conversation, we really understood that it wasn't just wage stagnation anymore that was one of the problems with how to have people have sufficient funds to build wealth. It's that the cash flow of how do they even be able to plan on that was different. And we had to really explore those dimensions of income volatility as the very first financial challenge. So I'd say that just the generosity of participants in the conversation as we convened together really did help inform and I think strengthen the individual work we were doing in the Financial Security Program, and hopefully in the field that we try to influence around some of those financial security innovations in financial markets.
Yeah, I mean, just a couple things just to add to that. So one, I do think it was interesting how we went sort of from this first conversation where people, it was a surprise to me the degree to which people weren't in the same rooms. I mean, you know, we've sort of brought some people from DC out to Aspen, and you think like, well, you are, you know, one of those DC people who seems to know everybody. How come you weren't in a conversation with some of these people before? So that was really actually surprising in some ways, and I think it was even surprising to the people in the room. And the thing I think that's been really gratifying, I mentioned a little, is, you know, some of the collaborations that have come out of this, and also just some of the reflections we've heard back from people about how it's informed their thinking, right? I think it's certainly informed our work and how we think about things. I was just talking earlier about how it has informed how we've thought about and talked about some of the job quality work that we're doing, right? And sort of building a richer understanding of what does it mean to have a quality job in somebody's financial life, and sort of bringing these conversations together. While we were speaking a different language, I think sort of borrowing some of each other's language has actually been helpful in terms of sort of how do you have a richer conversation about issues that are really sort of present for families today. And the other thing I guess I think about that is it really has, you know, we've been really privileged to bring people together who are really working hard in many spheres to try to say, we've got a lot of economic challenges in this country, and how do I bring my expertise, how do I bring my talents, how do I bring the work of my organization to really trying to move forward on some of those. And I think it's really broadened the palette for a lot of people of thinking about, well, why is it that this thing that I've been working on my whole life, why isn't it having more impact? And giving them opportunity to connect it to a broader set of economic issues, I think has really opened up opportunities for folks to do more meaningful work, and that's been really, really rewarding to see.
Can I add one thing, Sarah? And I'd put it as a question maybe back to you as well. I mean, I think at Aspen it's always a little bit hard to, you're never sure if you are creating a trend when you start talking about something, if you're hitching your, your wagon to somebody else's. But I do think that there's been a real confluence of this unpacking of people's financial lives and the context of the changing nature of work that has meant that while we haven't seen a lot of real data yet, we've seen an emergence of just huge interest among employers in the financial wellness of their workforce. And so that really, in some ways has, I think, if the goal is changing a national conversation, and ideally, when you're at Aspen, you're changing it in a way that means that leaders in all sectors are thinking, how do I solve this problem? Like they're not just thinking about it, they're actually people who are in a position to make a difference. And I see a lot of people leaning in to thinking hard about the additional dimensions of a benefits platform that would lead to financial wellness. Now, that's not everywhere. That's why we'll be unpacking these 3 buckets that you see in the report around incentives, the future of incentives, about what incents employers, and institutions, what are the new kinds of institutions so that you have to invent or reinvent, and also ownership. But I think that there's more people grappling with those things, and I think they're connected to a network that's going to help them with problem solving there. So I wonder, though, I think you were actually working on this at Prudential at the same time, so agree that this financial wellness focus is a growing piece of the the work?
Yeah, I think just across the private sector in general, whether you are a financial services company like ours or others, you're looking at your employees' health, and that is across the whole spectrum of whether it be their well-being in terms of their health or in terms of their financial health. And for us, it was really looking at all these studies that were out there by other companies and then our own financial wellness studies that says that 6 out of 10 employees are stressed about their financial situation. And that impacts an employee's productivity, their absenteeism, how they're producing at work. And so we took a look at how can we make sure that our products are addressing these needs for our clients and our customers. And our clients and customers range from individual customers to employer-based platforms. And so really taking a look at how do these individual financial stressors that impact people from across the range, whether they are at the low to moderate income levels or at middle to upper level income levels, they still face the same financial shocks and emergencies that place them back at ground zero if there is an emergency that takes place. And so as a company, it's our responsibility to make sure that our clients and customers are financially well and that they are able to manage their day-to-day expenses, they're able to manage their financial goals and really look towards the future. And that's something that companies for a long time just talked a little bit insularly about our products, and now really thinking about the well-being of the entire society and community at large. And so I think that there has been a movement in the private sector space in that. But one of the things that I wanted to ask you all is that I think surprising and challenging at the same time was this different language that the two sectors had in terms of, you use the example of equity and other words that people use in the workforce side versus on the financial capability side. And so I was curious from your perspective, what were some of the things that were challenging and how have you overcome them to bridge these two areas together?
You want to tackle it first?
Oh, thanks.
Oh, yeah.
She gives me this question first. Yeah, so I mean, well, the language was definitely. I think one thing. I think it was surprising. I mentioned sort of how people hadn't been in the same conversation before. I think that was kind of a challenge to have people sort of feel comfortable that they understood each other, that they actually could find their common goals and common purpose together. I think that was important to take some time to build that. I think that even some ways some of the statistics that I would typically follow may be different than the statistics that Ida would typically follow, right? So even how we were building sort of our what is narrative of the world was slightly different, and being able to bring those pieces together. Ida frequently cites the statistic about people, how much they have in savings and whether they can meet an emergency, right? I'm typically looking at sort of 1 in 4 adults earns a wage that's insufficient to lift a small family above the poverty line, right? So we think about it in slightly different terms, what the economic crisis means. So I think kind of bringing those things together and having people be able to sort of see each other's descriptors, as well as having a conversation where people can build an understanding of each other's incentives and motivation and why they're doing the work that they're doing. I think taking the time to do that, so it was a challenge, but also B, very worthwhile and a reward on the other side. All right, you can talk about how I'm challenging to work with.
No. I mean, I think collaboration overall, I think something that's a real learning of both of our programs is it actually takes more time and resources to get collaboration right than less, Right. So it's actually, it's not like it's a cost savings. And I think I credit the supporters of this work and understanding that if you're trying to get a flywheel moving, the amount of force that has to get it started and the resistance to it, right, is hard. And so for all of us, we had to try on, some new ways of working. And again, it really helps to work with such generous colleagues. And also, I just want to give a big shout out to the participants. They made things that could have been incredibly challenging less so. And there's so many in the room. There's been 3 years now. So while there's always some overlap, maybe 150 people that are all kind of tips of their own iceberg networks in terms of what they bring to the conversation. So I would say more surprising than challenging was how eager everybody was to get outside of their norms, how eager everybody was to learn. the inflection points and tipping points of a problem from somebody else's perspective. And so we did just a whole set of real starting points that were quite different from each other around the issues. So it was very different, for example, to have somebody from a labor union come in and see everything as a frame for, how do you organize the voice of workers and worker power, and have that come into the same conversation as a startup that's trying to disrupt work completely and in some ways give a whole different approach to how markets change, right? So there was just very different, so the challenging pieces of conversation, and I think we do challenge well at Aspen, where we really encourage disagreement at the table, but we encourage that in service of a productive conversation. And so this idea about what is the role of markets in solving the problem? What is the role of government in solving the problem? And if it is government, is it local? Is it state? Does it need to be international trade? I think somewhat of what we normed on last year was a lot of the upstream drivers to both what's happening with financial markets and labor markets being just the broader role that financial markets are playing in driving the ways that companies make investment decisions and the ways that disruptions in financial markets are changing even how people get access to products and services. So, I don't mean to punt on the conversation. I just mean that I think on net, for the American people and for the different kind of leaders who have come to these tables, both from the community level all the way to corporate CEOs, the surprise was it wasn't so much of a challenge to have these conversations. And I just encourage us to continue, even though this is a capstone of a 3-year initiative, really commencement of it, that we actually just see this as a starting point. There's so much work, and the agenda that we begin to lay out this year is just so exciting. And even if the conversation in DC doesn't feel like it's got a lot of traction right now, in the rest of the country, it's got incredible traction, and it's the conversation people want to be having.
Yeah, and just since as our supporter of this initiative, I wanted to say one tactical thing that's been very challenging is it's been a real challenge to sort of keep up with sort of, well, where are people going with this conversation and what are they doing next? But I did also just want to say that, while we keep referring to the summit, which has been sort of the big, sort of the centerpiece of the Reconnecting Work and Wealth Initiative, it's not the whole thing. And we've been doing a lot of other work on some of these issues around incentives, institutions, and ownership. We did the work on employee ownership in particular and thinking about that. But a lot of that work has been driven by people coming to us after the summit and sort of saying, here's something I want to work with you, and you are the folks we want to work with on. How do we drive forward this question of what are the new institutions that will help support workers in this changing economy, and what does that look like, and how can we have a next set of conversations around that? So I just wanted to say that it's really, I think it's been challenging to understand where are people going with all of this work, but it did, just to also echo what Ida was saying earlier, it does seem like people are really taking it forward and driving things. And so, and I guess we're going to get to hear more about that in the next panel, so maybe I should be quiet.
Well, we'll just end on this last note. I think going off of both what you both have said, from Prudential, as our commitment is that we are staying true to this commitment that we believe that everybody should have the opportunity to achieve financial security, and that comes from the income and the asset side. And so as you both see this work moving forward with the 3rd Economic Security Summit coming up, what would you like to see in this next year or two?
Okay, sure. Well, so I mean, I've been doing, within my program area, we've been doing a lot of work on sort of how do we think about work, the changing nature of work, and what does it mean to have quality work in today's economy. And so I'm really looking forward to opportunities to broaden and enrich how people think about that, how they understand that, how they understand the multiple drivers of that opportunity, and what that means for individuals, for businesses, for government, for the social sector. How do we think about the role of work in our society, and how do we think about quality work and how we value work and what that looks like. And so for me, it's been enriching to have this conversation, and I think it's opened opportunities to kind of bring that forward and continue to connect that to the wealth conversation. And I think that's really valuable. And I think just looking forward at a really sort of practical level, I think we have a lot of opportunities to I mentioned we sort of work kind of from the ground up. We have a lot of opportunities to sort of lift up things that are working and try to facilitate the engagement of more communities and sort of addressing the challenges of work. So I think this has really been really helpful to that conversation, and looking forward to carrying it even further and connecting it even more to thinking about work and wealth.
I love it. Sign me up. And I think just quickly for me, it's been interesting that, so we spent a lot of the time in the Work and Wealth Initiative really trying to get everybody's heads around a shared set of problems across these different markets and their implications for households. And that has meant, in some ways, when you have to deal with first-order problems first, that a lot of the short-term insecurity issues of workers have been what presented as the issues to have to tackle. My goals for the next few years will be both to really go ahead and focus this pivot to solutions, and the networks we need to build for solutions, and an evidence base for those solutions, and also, quite frankly, to get back to wealth. I do think that in some ways we tend to think that you have to deal with income before you can deal with assets, that you have to deal with short-term before you can get to long-term. That's a false trade-off. We have to tackle both. There are policy incentives and platforms for both. And so in the commitment to solutions, I want us to get back to really owning that, that we can't wait to start talking about the wealth component and double down on that in ways that I think many of us have been uncomfortable to do because of where that conversation has led us in terms of a 99% and a 1%. We can't afford to wait anymore as a country to have that conversation, and I think it matters to democracy, and I think it matters to the economy. So I think that's where we're going to go.
So with those next steps, we'll turn it back over to Rhett for the next panel. Thank you.
Thanks. Great, thank you.
Thank you so much. And while we're doing our stage change, I'd like to invite our panelists to the stage. Alice Mazer, who's the founding partner of the Commonwealth, Allison Omens, who's managing director at Just Capital, Andrea Levere, the president of Prosperity Now, and Todd Green, who's the recently appointed executive director of the Atlanta University Center Consortium. Is this working? Ah, there we go. All right. So I did a brief intro of who you are and who your titles, but I think I would love to open the conversation just a little bit with, tell us a little bit about who you are, your organization, but more specifically, what is your organization's vantage point on this work, and how exactly sort of that particular vantage point has shaped your thinking around reconnecting work and wealth. So Alex, can we start with you?
Great. Well, thanks for having me. I will say, as the lone Canadian on the panel, I know that we're having some trade conversations right now. We love collaborating with Americans. So,
I asked him if he charged him to get here, but...
Exactly. So I'm one of the co-founders of a company called Commonwealth. We work on basically issues of retirement security. And the thing we're most interested in is how can we take an institution that we think works very well, which is the pension or collective retirement plan, and try and adapt it to the realities of a 21st century workforce. So at the very essence of the problem we're trying to solve, which is really a retirement plan coverage and a retirement insecurity problem, it is an intersection of work and wealth. Because we have to think not only about efficient wealth accumulation and decumulation strategies, which is really about the retirement plan design, but we also have to think about the changing nature of work, which is about job tenure, which is about the growth of non-standard work, which is about changing institutions like labor unions and how that dynamic is changing and changing workforce practices. So, I think this framework has been very, very helpful to us in connecting up, silos and industries and sectors that often don't talk to each other. And we try to think a lot about not only the financial side of things, but also the kinds of institutions, I think we'll talk more about that later, that would help deliver these kinds of retirement benefits.
Absolutely, and we definitely want to dig down more into the institutions piece. But Allison, you guys have had some really exciting weeks. Congratulations to you and the whole team at Just Capital. Tell us a little bit about you and sort of your guys' intersection with the work.
Sure, so Just Capital is a nonprofit. We were founded about 4 years ago, and we basically exist to connect the values and priorities of the American people with corporate America. And we're looking through and trying to incentivize different ways that we can create environments in which companies can live up to those values. So we extensively poll people on what they think companies should be doing today, and then we take that framework and create metrics around it to actually measure the 1,000 largest publicly traded companies in the US. Last week, as Red is referring to, Goldman Sachs licensed our list of how all the companies are performing and launched a financial product called an ETF from it. It ended first day of trading with over 250 million assets, which is one of the largest ETF launches in history and the largest ESG fund, which means sort of all the environmental, social, and governance issues that companies sort of identify and track. So it's one example of the work that we're doing to try and incentivize better corporate behavior and sort of, to the sort of this question of how does this framework work for us. Basically, we're trying to charge and sort of ask the questions of companies: are you living up to all of these issues the American people care about, and simultaneously trying to create the incentives that makes that easier for companies to be living up to them.
And Todd, you have an interesting, congratulations.
Thank you.
You have an interesting perspective given your previous role and your current role. Can you tell us a little bit about how you're thinking about the frame and sort of your previous role and sort of looking forward?
Sure. I've had an opportunity to engage with several people in this room in my previous role at the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, where I led our workforce development efforts across the Federal Reserve System. So there, of course, we thought a lot about both workers and their economic returns, but we also thought a lot about how that fit into companies to make sure that our economy was growing very at an optimally productive way. That job is about 4 days a week old now, and I now am in day 4 of my new job, which I'll say is a bit less esoteric and really more focused on more directly about the people who are facing this issue with respect to thinking about work and wealth. So I am now the new executive director at the Atlanta University Center Consortium, which is that consortium is composed of 4 historically black colleges contiguously located in Atlanta. It's the largest and oldest. So it's Spelman College, Clark Atlanta University, Morehouse College, and Morehouse School of Medicine. And so there I'll be working on issues that actually speak to this very issue. So if you think about the history of these institutions, they were really founded by benefactors who were interested in helping people emerge out of slavery and into positions of connecting, building wealth, but also developing skills that were outside of the agrarian perspective into ones that could help them to prosper. So that's a little bit about that, but I wanted to share with you, already I'm sharing a quote from one of the former presidents of Morehouse College, but he was actually the mentor to Martin Luther King. And this quote was just, I think it really brings home the perspective that we have here. And Dr. Mays writes, "He who starts behind in the great race of life must forever remain behind or run faster than the man in front." And I think the work that we're all doing here today is to try to get people faster in that race. But the other part of it is that we've got to do, and Ida alluded to this, but this work is in the now, and we need to figure out ways. And that was a great thing about coming to the summit last summer, was to be in a room with people who actually forced my own thinking about making sure that these issues were addressed now. And of course, with having a high degree of economic prosperity across the country, we know that there are opportunities to kind of translate that to people who may not have been able to participate.
Thanks, Todd. And Andrea, I know Prosperity Now has been deep in this work. Can you share a little bit from your vantage point and all the exciting things you guys are doing?
Sure, nothing like starting with an inspiring quote, right, for all of us. So I'm the president of Prosperity Now. We have a mission of helping all people build financial stability, wealth, and prosperity. But I want to talk about how these two threads really were grounded in the founding of the organization 39 years ago and are being reinvented, I think, given how dramatically the world has changed today. So when we were founded as the exquisitely named Corporation for Enterprise Development 39 years ago, it was really an organization that was trying to create jobs, but also address wealth inequality. But of course, we didn't know what that word meant or that, in fact, was what we were doing. And really, the root was there was a major recession going on in the country. Let's see if people can invent their own jobs through self-employment and actually build their own wealth. And we came out with 3 lessons, which really are our core lessons that we work on today. 1, that low-income people have more capacity than they have opportunity, and it's our responsibility to create the on-ramps into the economy. It gets back to what we'll talk about in terms of the extraordinary racial wealth gap of the fact that there's not a level playing field at all. Secondly, we discovered that low-income people, when given the same structures and incentives that middle and higher income people get all the time, can succeed at exact the same rates and levels. So it's all about how do we set up the systems and the institutions so they work. And the final thing is that it's incumbent on us, and this is where we have to change the language, to turn the safety net into a ladder, so people don't just stop at a certain place. And what we've seen in the dramatic restructuring of the labor markets, and which we'll talk about more, the fact that there's been this huge risk shift from institutions, mostly in the labor market, onto individual households. We have to change how that works by really blending the labor markets with the safety net to build that wealth.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Andrea. So what I'd like to do is, I think you've heard a lot about how the work has evolved over the 3 years. We spent a lot of time really identifying a common set of problems. And as we're looking forward, really starting to think about solutions. And so one of the things I wanted to do was dig down a little bit on some of those 3 streams that we've talked about. And Allison, I want to start with you with kind of the incentives piece, because I think working with employers, you have sort of a unique perspective, especially as you're thinking about sort of upstream incentives of working with business. How is Just Capital thinking about that? More than just thinking about it, you guys are doing it, and what does that look like?
Yeah, so we're a new organization that's still experimenting with what incentives actually look like. Fundamentally, we believe that companies need more information on how and what they should actually be focused on, particularly on work and wealth questions. Our polling shows that the biggest issue by quite a bit that people care about have to do with how you treat your workforce, as well as other core operational issues. So we're focused, we're sort of focused on these questions of what do companies need to pay attention to? How do we ask those questions into the C-suite and ensure that the CEOs actually are looking at these questions within their workers? We sort of famously cite Mark Bertolini, the CEO of Aetna, who didn't know that a certain percentage of his workforce was on food stamps, and once he did, he addressed it and raised wages. So we fundamentally believe that working with companies and investors is an important role to be playing, to be addressing these core questions, both at a systems level, at a market level, as well as sort of within companies. What does work look like today? And we're analyzing and ranking companies according to those things. So we believe that we can create a better race to the top among companies who are raising their hands and saying, we want to be better, but we don't know how and we don't know what to focus on. And then we're trying to create financial products to sort of help capital along, to be working with investors, whether it's institutional investors or others, to be recognizing that there is an investor case for this behavior, that companies who are making more long-term decisions, investing more in capital expenditures, investing more in their workforce and training, you're seeing better returns, you're seeing better retention rates, and overall you're a healthier company in the long term. So we're trying to make that case, and simultaneously, just one other thing, this space still doesn't have enough data. We don't actually know what's happening among companies. And there's increasingly a conversation around being a good employer and companies raising their hand and saying we want to be creating jobs that allow people to bring their full selves to work, and that purpose is really important. But what we're trying to do is sort of build the back end and actually look at publicly available and crowdsourced data to understand what's actually happening and analyze companies according to those things. That it's not enough to just be publicly talking about it, that we actually need to ensure that it's actually happening, and what are those metrics and what are those data sources to be measuring it according to those things.
That's really helpful. Alex, I want to turn to you next to talk a little bit about sort of the institution's work. I know Allison was talking about sort of what's going on with products. I think you guys have been at the forefront of the work that you're doing with retirement. Can you talk a little bit about sort of how your work on retirement and sort of the Reconnecting Work on Wealth initiative, the sort of institution stream has sort of influenced your work? And Todd, I'd like to hear from you on that as well.
Sure. Yeah, so I'll try to get a bit more specific about how we think about institutions. So I guess one way to think about it is as a layer of solutions that is somewhere in between the public policy layer and the kind of products layer. And it's one that we think is really important. And the reason why is when you think about retirement, that story has played out in very much the same way that Andrea has talked about in terms of a risk transfer from institutions to individuals, largely in the form of the decline of the corporate pension plan. And there are many reasons for that, and part of how we try to think about it is not to sort of blame employers for doing that, because a lot of those forces have to do with changes in the economy, but actually to think about what are ways in which we can continue to have institutions to protect people, protect workers, that don't leave them on their own for retirement, that actually take into consideration the changes in the labor force and the economy. And so for us, that looks like partnerships with labor unions, partnerships with associations, in some cases partnerships with sectors, to design and manage collective retirement plans that are portable from job to job and that protect people, in our view, and based on the evidence, much better than a do-it-yourself type of arrangement. But this is a new space as well, and I think one thing that's been terrific about being able to collaborate with Aspen and the entire Aspen community is there are a lot of things that have to be tested out. This does require collaboration across sectors. I don't think it's something that one sector can solve on its own. And so, I think one way in which the Aspen work on this has inspired us as an organization is, we've been working on this initiative in Canada, which launched a couple of weeks ago, called the Common Good Retirement Initiative, which is all about getting a portable retirement plan, national portable retirement plan for the nonprofit and charitable sector, which has almost 1 million workers in Canada with no retirement plan. And that's really a collaboration between philanthropic capital, progressive employers in the sector who care about decent work, retirement experts, and the private sector. And in a way, it's an experiment to see if we can get something going. But it's that type of leadership from the sector and the kind of collaboration where we look to the Aspen model as a bit of an inspiration for how do you get sectors to work together to lead on these kind of cross-disciplinary issues.
Helpful. Todd, can you touch a little bit on sort of the regional piece of this? I think it's really interesting that you're based in the South with so much going on and all the work you do with underrepresented communities and sort of the role that the institution stream is sort of inspired for your work.
Well, definitely. And I think what I'd like to do, though, is maybe begin by two people who actually inspired and was really the background for a lot of the work as I think about it. One is Rick Wartzman, who wrote a fantastic book about the kind of the history of the middle class, and I think what's happened about how it kind of hasn't turned out and what companies have done or not done in order to support that. And so I think that work is really foundational to thinking about the past is always instructive about the future. And in thinking about the future, Ray Bashar, my former colleague at the Federal Reserve, has also done a lot of work that I think helps me to understand that a lot of this work is related to where you were born, or when you were born, rather, and also around your race, because there's been some discrimination, and et cetera. So really the lens that has been most intriguing to me, and hopefully this was the voice that I hoped to bring to the summit last year, was along these dimensions. One is around geography, Because when we talked about institutions, one of the challenges that I had was that these institutions didn't behave in the way that I'm accustomed to institutions behaving. And I mean not only the institution, which we might think of as the company, but also all of the other types of public agencies that support that. In many cases, there were questions in my mind about whether or not these institutions were actually wanting people to move ahead or to achieve wealth. And then the other part of that, of course, is the racial component. And there's been people of color there's lots of work around discrimination. And I think that in order for us to have a fulsome conversation about what this really means and how we can achieve it, we also have to think about place and we have to think about the population. And so bringing that down, I have seen a few things that have worked well, or at least I think are very promising in a Southern context, where arguably I know we don't have the monopoly on racial issues in the South, and nor do we have, these historic things. But the South was really built on cheap land and cheap labor. And so that's the mentality or the approach that a lot of people are approaching this from. Of course, the current economy is helping people to evolve around that. So just a few practical examples, I'll mention them really quickly. One is the Atlanta airport, which is, how many people have flown through the Atlanta airport? Okay, yeah. So we have an expression in the South, before you go to heaven or hell, you gotta transfer, you gotta connect in the Atlanta airport. But I'm sure that you may not have thought about the fact that the Atlanta airport is the largest economic engine in the Southeast. But it's also a very large home of very low-wage workers. So there is beginning to have some level of recognition about how do we provide opportunities and pathways so that people can have wealth and just have some level of sustainability and opportunity. So looking at things about having a university on campus where people can upgauge their skills, but also pathways to get people out of the hospitality or restaurant, fast food restaurants into logistics. So there's an organization called Career Rise, which has been generously funded by foundations to help to take a look at that, who's been modeling a lot of these practices. And employers are really stepping up to the plate, and that's been a very exciting kind of perspective about it. Then the second one, and I certainly don't want to take credit for this, Nancy Cantor, who's now the chancellor at Rutgers, but her work at Syracuse was about using institutions like universities, hospitals, airports as anchor institutions. So how can we think about these particular entities who, by the way, oftentimes have large employment shares within regions? And if we can get them to change their behavior, then that can also have the ability to influence the behavior of traditionally private sector employers. So we've been working a lot in our community, in our sets of communities, about how do we move this forward in helping these institutions be leaders around strategies that could include procurement or other things that can help to build wealth with small businesses. So perhaps I'll just stop there and I can share more.
It's a good transition to Andrea. Andrea, you said something on our prep call that's stuck with me. You said, I think we're at a real breakthrough regarding financial wellness. So can you tell us what you meant by that?
I will. First I'll say, go ahead. Rick.
Well, and then just more broadly, sort of how this work in the ownership stream has influenced.
Has been there. So you should know that my daughter went to Syracuse when Nancy Cantor was the chancellor, and her nickname was Chancy Nancy.
Oh,
just so you know. So I want to take that question and go back to what Ida said, which is, as we think about these issues, it's no longer an either or. We can't do that. So let me start with one of the areas we're looking at, which is opportunity youth employment programs. So what used to happen? You go through this great training program. These young people would get their first job, and they'd get a check, and where would they go? Where would they go? They'd go to the check casher, right? They don't have an account. They're not banked. Their parents are not banked. The data point, On average, a financially underserved person spends $2,400 a year on fees and interest. So when we would be challenged, or Ida knows, attacked by saying, you can't ask poor people to save, you know, they don't have enough money for things. We'd say, we just get them into a fair and affordable account, and if they only save half of that, suddenly look what they have. So the issue around financial wellness has been an issue that we've looked at within the public sector and very deeply in the private sector, and Sarah's been a real leader in this, which is essentially, it is a good business practice to reduce the financial stress that workers are having at all levels, but also to be innovative about what are the platforms that are ready to scale this work. So 2 weeks ago, we released a paper on savings for now and savings for later. And that's also not an either-or proposition. People need desperately, and Ida shared one data point on this, savings for emergencies. Otherwise, a small expense, the average payday loan is less than $500. A small expense can get someone in a spiral forever and affect their work life and their productivity and performance, and undermine the overall community assets that we have. So we have several different platforms that are now becoming very powerful platforms to address this. And the workplace is one. We'll talk more about how that's happening. But it is a place where there's all these innovations about how do we help someone automatically get an emergency savings as well as help to save for the longer term and do the pioneering work that Alex is doing for retirement. How do we use tax time, which is the time when low-income working people, through the Earned Income Tax Credit and the Child Tax Credit, are getting the most amount of money that they're going to see in an entire year? So with the incredible help of the academic Catherine Eden, whose agent, my friend Lisa's in the room, who researched for 2 years people who got the Earned Income Tax Credit and found out that for the first 6 months of the year, they were in positive cash flow. After 6 months, they went into negative cash flow, and where did they go? They went to the payday lender. If we could get them to save just a portion of that, a refund to Savings Act, and then have them hold it for 6 months, and then even have an incentive to match it, they would suddenly have a completely different financial outlook just leveraging that platform. And I'll close with one final note, which is the District of Columbia was supposed to basically approve the first refund to savings program, only it was the day of the Washington Capitol's parade. So they decided they could not have a hearing on this, which I thought was actually the right priority. But then it's coming up on the 26th. So one of the things I want to talk about is many more of the innovations that certain wonderful financial services companies are doing to link different automatic savings products to retirement accounts and other things.
So we want to get to your guys' questions. I want to do one more round, which I think is hopefully the exciting piece. And Todd, I'm going to start with you, so I'm going to giving you a little bit of heads up. I'm really excited. I'd love to know like what excites you and what are the areas of action that you see sort of in this body of work going forward. But maybe more importantly, who else needs to be part of the work going forward?
Yeah, so I'll just speak to the current context that I'm in now, and that is within this great consortium of being around some very, very smart young people, many of whom, not all of whom, but many of whom may have come from very humble beginnings, often first-generation students who haven't been exposed, or certainly who are not, who don't have wealth, but looking at how we're providing financial training, financial literacy, but matching that with job skills. But the third component, and I think this is really, really critical, and this is another one, I have to give credit to Maureen for helping me to think through this, and that has to do with how do we empower these young people who are matriculating into wonderful jobs into feeling like they have a voice about their own destinies. So you can select companies based upon the types of criteria that are important to you, but places where you actually have a voice. And I think that that's something new. That's a new concept to them, because many of them who have not worked in those types of environments, and certainly their parents and grandparents were subject to adhesion work arrangements where they were basically told what to do. So I think that's what excites me about this work. But I'm also excited about looking at how to test some of these concepts. And Ida talked about it's time for action now. So I'm really excited about how are we turning this what we've learned into some real test beds and work in action.
And do you think we have the right people at the table? You have thoughts about?
So I do. I always just want to make sure that the people at the table who are having these conversations need to look like the people who are actually subject to having these types of challenges. So we know that a lot of Black people and brown people are in very vulnerable work situations, and certainly in very precarious wealth situations. And so as we craft solutions, then I think it would be important for us to make sure that we have a room that looks like people who are facing those types of challenges.
Alex, what are you excited about?
Well, one of the things I'm very excited about is the whole idea of portable benefits, not just for retirement, more broadly. And specifically, how do we turn that from a concept, where I know there's been a lot of good discussion, to actually functioning pilots, functioning marketplaces? How do we start to think about what is the policy architecture for that look like? What are the delivery platforms and institutions who could be part of that in a way that will actually protect workers, that workers will trust? What are the products, both financial and non-financial, and technologies that can be part of delivering that? And then how can we start to actually test things in the real world, get experience, get data, report back, iterate? There's a lot of promise, I think, not only for the world of pensions and retirement, but across health, across training, across broader financial wellness, including short-term. And so, that's the kind of work that I'm very, very excited to be involved in.
That's great. And Allison, I think one of the most exciting pieces of this work for me personally has been the work with employers. And I think employers' new level of engagement and the opportunity to reach people using employers. Can you speak a little bit about sort of where you see your work with employers going? What excites you about that?
Sure. I mean, I think that it's so interesting to me because we're all sort of focused on different things, but I do think there's an optimism here right now on the big picture questions. On, both of you brought up risk, for example, and thinking about what role, companies sort of recognizing that risk has shifted away from employers, and what does that mean in terms of their overall engagement as well as the kinds of jobs that they're creating. And for me personally, I think that on sort of the work question and quality questions and a lot of the work that you and Maureen have been doing, as well as just other things that I'm seeing out there defining what a quality job means and bringing employers to the table for that there's this moment where we have convenings going on. We increasingly have groups that are standing up and saying, we're moving away from sustainability, or we're redefining sustainability to talk not just about the environment, but about companies' responsibilities for their own workforces. And then we have organizations like Just Capital and certainly B-Lab and SASB and others that are trying to actually measure what companies are doing under the hood. And so I think that there's going to be an interesting coalescing in the next couple of years on what does it mean, what does a quality job mean, and what role do companies have in defining that and then meeting it. And if they're not, then what role do they have in this conversation? How do they interact with portable benefits? How do they interact sort of with underserved communities that they might not be creating work opportunities for, but they're certainly serving and working and sort of operating in? And so what expectations do they have as anchor institutions as well to be part of the solutions to either what their workforce or the broader communities they're in are experiencing?
And do you have unique thoughts about who, obviously, I would assume you feel strongly business should be at the table. I mean, do you have thoughts about who's not at the table, or?
Well, I mean, I think, from Just Capital, obviously we believe the American people should be at the table, and that in this moment of populism, there's clearly a lack of voice that just people generally feel. Again, just workers specifically, sort of the day-to-day experiences that people are facing, I think, is really important, as well as from a company perspective. It's very interesting to interact with companies themselves, because oftentimes we're working with a huge array of companies within roles, if it's marketing or sustainability or investor relations. Oftentimes the people that aren't at the table is folks who are doing HR and who are actually working on the day-to-day sort of benefits and sort of this area that oftentimes we hear is a little bit more antiquated than some of the other areas within a company. And so ensuring that we have the people who are actually at the front line making benefits decisions and dealing with software that actually has real impacts on people's day-to-day lives. And so ensuring that sort of, both the HR side and workers are sharing that and showing what isn't currently working and creating opportunities and sort of identifying ways that it really is just a efficiency question rather than anything else. But through those sort of efficiency decisions, you can have huge impact on huge workforces.
And Andrea, I think you're always excited. But what are you particularly excited as it relates to this work?
The first thing is we have a lot of data. And what we've discovered, and those of you who have looked through the Prosperity Now scorecard and the data that we have, is that it changes the conversation, because suddenly people aren't battling over turf, but they're looking at the reality of the economic realities. So I'll just use one data point out of all the data, which is we have a report called the Ever-Growing Gap. And what it looks at is the racial wealth divide. And what it measures is if African American wealth continues to grow at the rate it's growing today, it'll take 228 years for African Americans to have the same wealth as white people today. And it'll take 74 years for Hispanic families. That one data point has resounded more powerfully than many, many others in basically saying we need very significant solutions to come to the table if we're ever going to talk about opportunity in this country and change the structure by which people live their lives. And also, what I think is so powerful, many of you have seen the research that Rod Shetty has done, right? That even kind of African American families that have high salaries, he calls it wealth, it's not, are lagging, but he doesn't look at their wealth. And as all our staff said, if he had looked at the wealth of these households, the outcomes that he found, he could have predicted from the get-go because of those differences. So with that data, what I have seen across the country is all sorts of new partners coming together because people across every sector understand that if they don't deal with the financial insecurity of their patients, of their clients, of their workers, they're not going to accomplish their own goals, and they're leveraging their resources. And then the last piece, as we know, we have lost every program that matches the savings of low-income people in the last year and a half. And we have companies, such as Prudential and other companies, that have stepped up and said, this is unacceptable. And we need to begin to innovate in ways that help people build savings on the short term and the long term. And that is why your data is so critical, because companies can say, we are platforms that can achieve scale, not the scale of the federal government, but can achieve meaningful scale until we're able to bring them in as a partner again, and doing this at the local and state level where there's an incredible amount of innovation, and innovation that goes into, and I'll add one more plug for the work here, the Job Quality Fellowship, which really is how do we reinvent jobs. For the first time, I asked my staff to nominate folks for that fellowship who were bridging these two worlds, who's in the workforce, looking at the quality of work, but also building savings and assets. And these folks were so excited to be able to bridge those worlds and figure out how on a day-to-day basis we can work together.
And Maureen has a huge smile on her face, for those of you. So I know you want to say, and so we have about 4 minutes left before we move to questions. I'd like to give everyone an opportunity, just 1 minute, about what are the action steps for you, and what do you want to leave? What do you think folks should leave with today? So just 1 minute. Todd, we'll kick off.
Yeah, so really quickly, another thing I'm really excited about is that the conversation has changed within economic development circles. So these are people who are responsible for bringing and thinking about jobs and how jobs are created in communities, and now they are beginning to pivot. So I'm excited about the fact that every community didn't want Amazon by saying they wanted 50,000 jobs paying $100,000 a year. Some communities said, I need to think about the indigenous people. Who are the people here, and what kinds of opportunities do they need in order to move ahead? For the very first year, the International Economic Development Council is having their annual meeting, and it's about equitable economic development. So thinking about job quality, not just the traditional metrics around the number of jobs or either the amount of investment, and digging down into that. So I'm excited about that, and so I took up more than my minute, so I can't answer the question you just asked me.
But you gave Allison enough time
Yeah.
to think about it, because I didn't put this in the prep. So Allison, in 1 minute, what do you want people to leave with?
I think that I feel like we're moving away from, and I know my organization agrees, away from the Milton Friedman sort of shareholder primacy. All it takes is to be, the most important thing, the only thing, is for companies to be delivering value for their shareholders. I think one of the reasons we're moving away from that is, one, it's not working for communities and not working for society. It's also not working for companies, and it's not working, and so it's not working, period. What role we have to play is to be having new expectations about what we should be expecting in these conversations overall about what role companies should be playing forward. And I think that the more we can be asking those questions and be making decisions, we have a new fund, which I'm not supposed to talk about, but which can be sort of making decisions, either your dollars or where you're working based on these expectations. Sort of the more we'll be able to incentivize and to be encouraging this sort of shift towards a new kind of holistic corporate behavior and decision making.
Absolutely. Alex?
Yeah, I mean, I love the points that were made about it not being either or, between short-term and long-term, between income and wealth. I think those are terrific points to leave with. They're not my points, but I would reinforce them. I think for us, it's really about trying new things. If we want to try and reverse the decline and call it retirement plan coverage or pension coverage, then we have to think about new kinds of partnerships, whether it's with labor unions or new worker organizations or associations or sectors, in the case of nonprofit sector, and see what works, and try to bring new people to the table, including got some new ideas from you as well in terms of the employer conversation not being a one-dimensional conversation. There's many different parts within an employer. Trying to think a little bit differently about that as well.
Andrea, you want to take us home?
So I'd make one more Aspen link and then one final link, which is it also brings us to look at the entire family and what these pieces need to look like to create household financial security. So I was lucky to be a fellow in the Ascend program, and one of our most exciting areas of work were children's savings accounts to help break the intergenerational transfer of poverty by getting an account to a kid as early as in kindergarten. But what that did was really change how the parents and their workplaces help to see this issue. And then I'll say a final thing. I see my friend Mary Griffin here, and one of the things I want to say is by doing this work well, it also supports consumer financial protection. And if there's an area where all of us need to take responsibility for advancing that, again, in light of losing one of the most important policies that has ever been enacted in terms of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, having these kind of programs and initiatives helps bring the message of consumer financial protection and the options of how to create a stable financial life.
Helpful. We're now going to open it up for questions. I'm told that if you're streaming online, you can tweet a question to us, which sounds very exciting. Please raise your hand. We have some folks going with the mic. So, awesome.
Thank you.
Can you give us your name and who
yes,
you're with us?
Ann Hoffman from the Woodbury Fund, but also a lifetime in the labor movement. And until the very end of this discussion, the whole hour, I hadn't heard anybody talk about transferring wealth. We have the 1% that's got it all, and we've got to start talking about how we move that into the hands of people who don't have it. We can't create equality without getting some of the money back from the 1%. And the other thing that I wanted to raise, and it finally got raised, was the idea that corporations are supposed to serve only their shareholders. It's nonsense, and it can't work. That they need to consider their workers and their communities at least.
Thanks for the question and kind of statement. Andrea, can I ask you to respond on the wealth piece?
So we just launched a campaign called Fair Shot 2020, which looks into the structure of the tax code and the fact that the overwhelming majority of the, as of our last count, $660 billion worth of incentives for wealth building goes not to the top 1%, but the top 1% of the 1%. And that's just bad economic policy, let alone bad morality. So how do we change those tax policies so that we provide the kind of incentives to the asset poor majority that then helps drive the economy and changes the economic structure? So I'll start with that.
Allison, do you want to say anything about the role of companies?
Just to agree. I mean, we're trying to, as I've talked about, I mean, we're trying to redefine what it means to be a successful company today and simultaneously building the business and investor case for it. I think, our founder sort of talks about it as modernizing capitalism, but ultimately we just have to go there, and we've seen the results of what you're talking about, shareholder primacy, and clearly we need to be shifting, and so that's what my organization's trying to do. So yes.
Wonderful. Additional questions right here in the front.
My name is Araceli Barameño. I'm with the Center for Responsible Lending. Thank you so very much for your presentation and your remarks. My question is, and I'll just preamble it very simply by saying the wealth of our nation was created through policy. And so in that regard, I applaud any initiative that tries to find market-based solutions to a problem that has a very long history set through policy. Right? We will not be able, even if we change, and I support changing the tax code so that people who have less are able to have more. But I don't think that we would be able to actually solve it just through a piecemeal approach. So I want to challenge all of you to think about boldly in what bold aspirational ideas can we begin to put on the table that are really going to bring about change, because we can't wait 228 years or 70 whatever years. Thank you.
Todd, do you want to share maybe some of your thoughts on?
Yeah, so some of these I'll just say are not necessarily my own ideas, but the first obvious one has to do with elections, so that we can just take that. But it needs to be said. But other things like, what are we teaching in our business schools? And how can we think about having a different kind of way that we think about business success? So it's got to start somewhere. I think the other places would be our management consulting firms, who have a lot of influence in terms of companies and their strategies. So if there's an ability to influence there. So I think that we have to develop strategies to proselytize more people who believe that I'm wealthy, but my worker also can have wealth, and that doesn't mean that I'm not going to be able to do what I need to do and have success also. So going back to this notion about shared prosperity, and then the last part is just values. And so I think something has happened, and I think it could also happen in the home. So we can, your child might be the next, I don't know, Steve Jobs or whatever. So just being able to instill in our children that, you know, I can do well, but I also support other people, because at the end of the day, that's what it's about.
And Alex, I wanted to ask you, I think you have an interesting perspective, obviously being a Canadian and sort of peering in, but you do a lot of work in the US. Do you have any thoughts?
Well, I mean, most of the thinking we do around policy, is around our retirement system. And, you might be surprised to know that Canada has some of the same weaknesses in our retirement system as the US. If you work outside the public sector, you're not likely to have a retirement plan through your work. And as Andrea alluded to, we have a kind of upside down regressive tax system as well. So one of the initiatives we're working on, I wouldn't say it's a massive initiative, but we think it's a very important one, is to try to bring a version of the US savers credit to Canada, so there is some incentive for low and moderate income people to save, and hopefully we can learn from some of the lessons of what hasn't worked about the savers credit in terms of delivery and also design. Yes?
We just did away with the fiduciary rule. What is it like in Canada?
Well, if we could bring some of that energy up to Canada as well, because many investors don't have fiduciary protection. We don't have very good fee disclosure. And consumer financial protection is quite weak. So although we do some things very well, I would say, from a healthcare perspective, I think generally works well. From a public sector pension perspective, generally works well. We have a lot of gaps. And low and moderate income households outside the public sector are not particularly well served at all. So, that's within our space, but, there's a much broader space in terms of a more redistributive tax policy and minimum wage laws and all sorts of really important things that have to happen at the policy level.
It sounds like a deeper conversation over cocktails, too. Katie says we have a question from Twitter.
Yes, we have a question from Twitter. Tracy Scott asks, can the panel talk about mounting debt and its depressing impact upon work and wealth?
Yeah. Andrea, can you kick us off there?
So there's several different kinds of debt. One of the interesting data points is that the most common kind of debt is still credit card debt. And that's still what people are using to make up for the fact that they have had profound wage stagnation, and that basically this becomes the way that they live at a level that their wages should allow. But with that comes a couple of key things, which is, I can't look at the person who asked the question, so I'll look. Oh, there you are. Oh, great. Oh, that's so nice. The two other issues that I want to raise is the very high percent of Americans who have a subprime credit score. So what that means, because of whatever debt they have, it could be student debt, it could be others, that their cost of borrowing and their access to borrowing is severely compromised. And so one of the key issues is how do we continue to innovate, we haven't talked about this at all, in helping people to build their credit and linking that to the right kind of financial products to do it. The last piece, which everybody knows, and I don't have to go into this, is the implication of excessive amount of student debt, right, for not just household formation, but for all the other economic activities that these people would be engaging in, that they are constricted because of the student debt and the position of the debt on their own personal balance sheet and credit score.
That's all, Andrea. And one of the things I wanted to mention is here at Aspen in the Financial Security Program, we're doing really impressive work on debt, primarily through our EPIC program and our Consumer Insights program. So I would really encourage you all to look at that work as well. Question. Eric, I see you in the back, and I know you. So.
Hey, Eric Reddick, Small Business Majority. It's for the whole panel, but also for Alex. You mentioned some of these pilots you're doing and thinking through. I guess we can take the retirement space. Could you dig into what those products look like and kind of some takeaways that you might have learned from doing those pilots with unions, et cetera?
Well, I'll focus maybe on the nonprofit one because that's probably most relevant to small employers. So the proposal is basically to create a nonprofit entity that would be a portable retirement plan for a sector. So anybody who works in the sector, whether you're an employee or a freelance worker, could join this portable retirement plan. It would look a little bit like some of the state-sponsored plans that are out there, except it would also include employer contributions. And I would say be on an optional basis, and it would be, I would say, perhaps more robust in terms of the type of design if it were able to scale. But it's at a pilot phase. We need to get a certain number of employers signed up to it. I would say in the early first couple of weeks of this campaign, the amount of employer interest has been quite high. Because I think that some of the main objections that employers have to providing a retirement plan, cost, complexity, legal responsibility, are taken away from the employer with this type of model. The employer becomes basically a participant who can offer it, make contributions, et cetera. And so on that, I think there are a lot of employers that want to offer high quality benefits to their workers. And so we're trying to take away some of the main obstacles and make it voluntary, and also to try to facilitate a bit of a conversation around decent work in a sector that I think has wanted to have that conversation for some time. So complex to get going, early days, but I'd say a positive amount of early employer interest.
Wonderful. I think we have time for one more question, sir.
I'm Norm Kurland from the Center for Economic and Social Justice. And I have a question regarding, no question about work. The system ought to create work which you love. Mm-hmm. But now we have robots that are replacing human beings in many industries. Artificial intelligence. I'm not clear from any of the discussion so far, but I'm wondering whether there have been any discussions on the ideas of a man named Louis Kelso. Nobody? Okay. But if you're familiar with worker ownership, I worked with Kelso, and we got the first ESOP laws through the Congress in 1974. And there are now millions of workers who've been able to purchase, become
So we're just running, do you have a question? We're just running low.
Yes, I do.
Okay.
Because first I wanted to hear anything about any of the speakers in terms of that. Because what we're talking about is a way in which the Federal Reserve has a power to generate money under Section 13 of the Federal Reserve Act, so that workers have become owners without putting up their own money on credit, capital credit. Great. That pays for itself.
Okay.
However,
thank you. I'm just because we're running really low on time. Todd, do you want to say anything? And then we would love to take this offline. We're actually, in our Economic Opportunities program, we actually have a senior fellow, Joseph Blasi, who's been doing a lot of work on employee shared ownership. And we just about a month ago had a whole day event on the issue. But Todd, do you have any thoughts?
I actually don't want to say anything, but I'm just so grateful to not have to say. The viewpoints are my own. They do not represent the Federal Reserve Bank or Federal Reserve System. So I finally get a chance to say that. So I don't, I appreciate the comment, and certainly the Federal Reserve and others have done a lot of work at looking at the dynamics of labor market, the changing nature of work, and those are all tremendous concerns to how the economy is going to function, not the least of which is how we think about youth who often have their first jobs at McDonald's or other places where they learn employability skills. But yet, if those jobs are going to robots, then that's even fewer jobs that they have. So it's a serious concern, and I don't necessarily have a good answer for you.
Wonderful. Well, please join me in thanking our panel for their insights and for their time and travel. And then we just quickly, before we close, I'd like to say we have good news and bad news. The good news is that we have cocktails. The bad news is that because it's so hot today in Washington, we're not going to be able to enjoy those on the rooftop, but we do have a beautiful setup out here where you can still see the views and folks can go outside. Thank you all so much for joining us, and please join us in the foyer for drinks and conversation.